In late May 2025, the U.S. Department of Agriculture made headlines again, halting all imports of live cattle, horses, and bison from Mexico as the New World screwworm spread dangerously close to the southern border. Mexican authorities, in turn, rejected multiple shipments of American beef at their ports. Container after container of frozen meat now sits stranded, awaiting destruction under strict biosecurity rules. At the same time, Canada has been signing billion-dollar beef export contracts with Mexico, quietly filling the gap left by the U.S. and reshaping the North American meat trade. The once seamless cattle and beef supply chain across the continent is now fractured, with tensions rising on both sides of the border. Is this simply a fight over animal health standards, or the opening move in a much larger shift in North America's agricultural power map? For decades, the beef trade between the United States, Mexico, and Canada was a well-oiled machine. Under NAFTA and later the USMCA, cattle and beef products moved almost seamlessly across borders. Mexican ranchers relied on U.S. feedlots and processing plants, while American and Canadian exporters tapped into Mexico's growing middle-class appetite for premium beef. In 2022, the U.S. exported over $1.2 billion worth of beef to Mexico, making it one of America's top foreign markets. Canadian producers, though smaller in scale, enjoyed their own steady foothold, shipping both live cattle and processed meat southward without major interruptions. The three nations had found a balance. Mexico gained supply, the U.S. maintained dominance, and Canada benefited from a dependable niche. But under the surface, vulnerabilities were already forming. In 2023, localized disease outbreaks in livestock herds caused temporary border slowdowns. In 2024, climate-driven droughts in Texas, Alberta, and northern Mexico strained feed and water supplies, driving up production costs. At the same time, consumer demands in Mexico began to shift toward traceable, disease-free, and sustainably produced meat, demands that Canadian exporters, with their rigorous national traceability program, were better positioned to meet. By late 2024, the first real cracks appeared. Biosecurity inspections at Mexican ports grew stricter, shipments faced more frequent delays, and political rhetoric in Washington over agricultural self-reliance signaled a brewing policy shift. These early tremors set the stage for the crisis of 2025, when a parasitic outbreak, escalating trade tariffs, and shifting market loyalties would converge to rupture one of North America's most stable agricultural relationships. The days of quiet, predictable beef flows were over, and the scramble for control of the Mexican market had begun. In early 2025, the United States made a high-stakes decision that would reverberate through the beef industry. On March 4th, the administration imposed a sweeping 25% tariff on most goods from Canada and Mexico, alongside a 10% tariff on imports from China. The official line was that these measures were necessary to protect American producers from unfair competition and to incentivize domestic production. Yet, for the beef sector, these tariffs were a double-edged sword. While they aimed to shelter U.S. ranchers from cheaper imports, they also risked alienating critical export markets that had sustained the industry for decades. Then came the biological blow, the New World screwworm outbreak in southern Mexico. In November 2024, USDA temporarily suspended imports of live cattle from Mexico, citing the parasite's dangerous spread. By May 2025, the situation had escalated. The USDA extended the suspension to all live cattle, horses, and even bison crossing the southern border. Officials argued that the risk to domestic herds was too high and that biosecurity measures were non-negotiable. From a public health perspective, the policy made sense. From a trade perspective, it was devastating. Mexican ports began rejecting U.S. beef shipments outright. Containers that had traveled thousands of miles from Texas, Nebraska, and Kansas sat under the scorching sun, waiting for destruction orders. Some had already been held for weeks in refrigerated storage, racking up costs that exporters would never recoup. USDA spokespeople insisted that these were necessary precautions to maintain consumer confidence in North American beef. Privately, exporters accused the government of letting a controllable outbreak spiral into a trade disaster. For smaller U.S. processors, the combination of tariffs, lost exports, and growing domestic surpluses was suffocating. Plants in the Midwest and Southwest cut back on shifts. Cold storage facilities overflowed. Prices at the retail level, paradoxically, stayed high, partly because the supply chain had become so fractured that moving surplus meat to domestic shelves was slow and costly. Consumers wondered why they were paying $24 per pound for ground beef, while news outlets showed images of perfectly good U.S. beef being bulldozed in Mexico. Industry leaders warned of a deeper problem. The U.S. had become too reliant on just-in-time, high-volume export models. Any disruption, whether a tariff war, a disease outbreak, or a political standoff, sent shockwaves through the system. And now, with Mexico actively seeking alternative suppliers, the risk wasn't just temporary loss. It was the potential permanent erosion of U.S. dominance in the Mexican beef market. Canada saw an opening and moved fast. With U.S. beef shipments stalled and Mexican buyers desperate for reliable supply, Canadian producers stepped in to fill the gap. Leveraging their stringent national traceability system, which tracks every animal from birth to processing, Canada was able to assure Mexican officials that their shipments met the highest biosecurity standards. Within weeks, Canadian exporters signed contracts worth billions of dollars, locking in long-term supply agreements that could reshape the continental trade balance. For Alberta's beef industry, this was nothing short of a windfall. Feedlots ramped up operations, processing plants increased shifts, and logistics companies rerouted container traffic toward Pacific and Prairie corridors to reach Mexico more quickly. Canadian officials framed the surge not as opportunism, but as the natural outcome of years of investment in food safety and traceability. "We built this system for moments like these," one trade representative told reporters. Yet the rapid expansion wasn't without strain. Domestic prices in Canada began to rise as more beef was diverted to export markets. Smaller Canadian retailers complained of tighter supply and higher wholesale costs. Ranchers, flush with new demand, faced the challenge of scaling production without compromising standards, a balancing act that, if mishandled, could backfire in both domestic and export markets. Still, the political optics favored Ottawa. While Washington was locked in a defensive posture, battling both a parasite outbreak and diplomatic fallout from its tariff policies, Canada projected stability and reliability. Mexican media lauded the new partnership, framing it as a win for both nations. The narrative was clear: Canada had stepped in where the U.S. had faltered. What made Canada's maneuver particularly strategic was its timing. By securing multi-year contracts, Canadian exporters weren't just patching a temporary supply hole, they were embedding themselves into Mexico's long-term procurement plans. Even if the U.S. resolved its screwworm crisis tomorrow, regaining lost market share could take years, if it happened at all. Now, North America's beef trade sits at a crossroads. The U.S. is grappling with the dual challenge of eradicating the screwworm threat while navigating the political blowback from its own tariff policies. Mexico, having diversified its suppliers, has less incentive to return to a U.S. dominant model. Canada, though newly empowered in the Mexican market, faces the logistical and production strains of sustaining its expanded role. Diplomatic talks have stalled. U.S. negotiators insist that any reopening of the beef trade with Mexico must come with strict guarantees on animal health and reciprocal tariff relief. Mexican officials counter that they cannot compromise on biosecurity and have no intention of dismantling their new trade channels with Canada. The impasse is costly for everyone. American beef producers are losing revenue and market share. Canadian producers are balancing on a tightrope between export growth and domestic stability, and Mexican consumers are paying higher prices for imported beef due to the supply chain overhaul. In other words, what began as a biosecurity measure has evolved into a geopolitical contest, one where no player can retreat without losing face, and no resolution appears within easy reach. At first glance, Canada appears to be the clear winner in this trade realignment. Alberta's cattle ranchers are enjoying unprecedented demand. Processing plants are running at near full capacity, and export revenue to Mexico is projected to grow by over $1.5 billion in 2025 alone. The headlines have been glowing, portraying Canada as the steady hand in North American agriculture. But in the towns where beef is a way of life, the story is more complicated. Take Brooks, Alberta, home to one of Canada's largest beef processing facilities. The surge in exports has created more shifts, drawing in seasonal workers from across the province. However, local retailers are seeing a very different trend: higher prices and tighter supply for domestic consumers. Wholesale beef prices for Canadian supermarkets have risen as much as 18% since March, forcing smaller grocers to either absorb the costs or pass them on to customers. For ranchers, the pressure is equally real. Meeting the sudden spike in export demand means pushing production cycles harder, which risks undermining Canada's hard-won reputation for animal welfare and quality. It's not just about selling more cattle, one Alberta rancher noted. It's about keeping the standards that got us here in the first place. If quality slips, the very contracts Canada is celebrating could be jeopardized. The Canadian government is now navigating a delicate balancing act, promoting its newfound trade dominance while ensuring that domestic consumers and small retailers don't feel like collateral damage. If mismanaged, the political goodwill from this export surge could erode quickly at home. In the United States, the fallout has been swift and brutal, especially for smaller operations that lack the financial cushion to weather extended export losses. In Amarillo, Texas, a family-run beef processor that once shipped a third of its output to Mexico has cut production by 40% since May. Cold storage units are overflowing, and workers have been sent home early as the company scrambles to find domestic buyers. The paradox is glaring. While warehouses brim with unsold beef, retail prices remain stubbornly high. Transport bottlenecks, limited processing slots, and retailer contracts negotiated months in advance mean that surplus meat doesn't simply flow to supermarket shelves. Instead, much of it ends up frozen for months, sold at a discount to secondary markets, or, in the most devastating cases, destroyed. Consumers are frustrated. News segments showing bulldozers covering piles of perfectly edible beef in Mexican disposal sites have fueled public anger. Why am I paying $24 a pound if they're throwing it away across the border? One shopper asked during a local TV interview. That sentiment is spreading, and with it comes political heat for the administration. For the U.S. beef industry, the losses go beyond revenue. Market share, once ceded, is notoriously difficult to win back. If Mexican importers grow accustomed to Canadian supply, and if Canadian exporters continue to meet their needs, America could find itself locked out of a market it once dominated. In the long run, that could mean permanent structural changes to the North American beef trade, with the U.S. on the outside looking in. The North American beef trade has reached an inflection point. The U.S., once the undisputed leader, is now sidelined by biosecurity crises and self-imposed trade barriers. Canada, suddenly elevated to primary supplier status for Mexico, is grappling with the strains of rapid expansion and the political risks of rising domestic prices. Mexico, meanwhile, enjoys new leverage in choosing suppliers, no longer bound to a single dominant partner. Yet, for all three countries, the underlying challenge is the same: stability. Without a coordinated approach to disease control, tariff policy, and supply chain resilience, the next disruption could be even more destabilizing. And the stakes go beyond meat. This is about food security, economic sovereignty, and the politics of trust. So, will North America rebuild its fractured beef trade on shared standards and cooperation? Or are we witnessing the first chapter of a permanent realignment in agricultural power? Like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.